Hello, AP World History students. Welcome. We got a lesson here about a new type of empire being established by these European powers in this period, 1450 to 1750, these maritime empires or overseas empires. We'll talk about a couple of the major ones and talk about the methods that went into it. Sometimes it's a little grim, as empire often is. There's no such thing as the Care Bears empire, after all. But we're going to just explore some of this stuff together. So our targets, I can evaluate the ways that European states grew into maritime empires, and I can consider the moral consequences of their methods. We're doing here. We are trying to be Christian learners and really fully inhabit our faith as we encounter these stories. And also our long-term target, I can evaluate the benefits and the costs in the growth of empires and trade networks. So, as opposed to these large land-based empires, we have these overseas maritime empires. And when you look at this map, you see a lot of orange, I suppose. That's the Spanish, and we can see some gold, the Portuguese empire, and up here we have the northern powers of England and France, and the Dutch are going to be involved in here a little bit. We're going to just talk about how did this happen and what was the result a little bit, and what do we think? What do we make of this? We'll start this story off with the so-called Iberian powers, and that's Spain and Portugal. The Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula that Spain and Portugal inhabit. And we know that the age of exploration kicked off with Portugal and Vasco da Gama and Prince Henry the Navigator and some of those bits in the 1400s. By the 1500s, the Portuguese are well underway in this process, and they establish what we call a trading post empire, which means that in lots of places, if you look at this, they're controlling, like the rim region of Brazil, but more significantly, the outer rim areas in Africa and India and some chunks of Southeast Asia. They are not going in and like fully conquering huge chunks of land like we might think of with the Spanish, for example, or later on other empires. They're like establishing footholds in all these trading ports and trading posts. And we'll do some work later in the year to really explore how they did this. But again, it wasn't by just coming in and winning the Mr. and Miss Congeniality Award. They sort of, they kicked the doors down in many cases and said, we want to play a part in this trade. And sometimes they just set up and dominated this trade. Now, later on, they're going to get surpassed by the Spanish a bit, and then definitely by the Dutch. And we'll talk about how that takes place here. Spain would take the lead and Spain would become probably the most famous or infamous of these maritime empires during the 15th and 16th centuries, in large part because they're the ones who colonize the Americas. And we've explored this one a little bit over the summer with our Guns, Germs, and Steel reading. And frankly, it's a hard one to do briefly in an e-learning context because it's just so grave and so awful. It involves the death of a majority of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, primarily from disease, as part of the Columbian Exchange. And that's just such a fateful twist and a fateful moment. And because of that, small numbers of Spanish conquistadors are able to conquer and control and take over for these enormous empires, especially the Aztec and Inca empires. And we know that, gunpowder weapons were part of it, and horses were a part of it, and certain key strategies were part of it. But disease, in particular smallpox, is the biggest thing that tells the story there. And so that period of time from when 1515, when Hernán Cortés arrives in Mexico and engages with the Aztec people and then goes to war with them and conquers them. And then Francisco Pizarro and the Inca people sometime later, Pizarro using the same playbook. It's a fateful 20 years. This is not the only place we engage with this story, but it's worth just a slowdown to consider what the human face of this looked like. Now, once Spain had removed the political powers that be in Mexico and South America, they set about profiting and exploiting the resources and the people there. It's fair to say that the Spanish conception of what they were doing in North America and these colonies was different from what the English would do later on, or the Dutch would do later on, or even the French. To the Spanish, the Spanish understood all these conquered territories as the possession of the Spanish monarch, right? So these are the belongings, these are the holdings of the Spanish monarch, and these lands would then be distributed to specific, viceroys or governors, and they are told, I want you to extract wealth, starting with mineral wealth, but it can also be through sugar plantations or coffee plantations. I want you to extract wealth from this place to return it to the Spanish crown. So it's all the sort of government-directed affair. We will see later on with other places, it wasn't nearly so kind of government-run or centrally run. And frankly, that ends up working to the advantage of those other places, pardon me. The encomienda system is pretty infamous or pretty notorious. And this is like the way that the Spanish conceived of how the labor would work in this whole project of extracting wealth. So the idea is we've got a lot of silver mines, we got a lot of gold mines and sugar plantations and whatnot to be worked. And we want that work to be done by the indigenous peoples who lived there. And the idea was, this is a rueful laugh. It's just so wicked, honestly. But the idea was, here's the trade-off. We will provide protection for these indigenous peoples, and we will Christianize them. We will provide them with eternal life through the Christian faith. And in exchange, they will work for us. And the Spanish said, this shouldn't be such a shock to the system. After all, if you were part of the Inca Empire, or you sat under the Aztec Empire, you're used to paying tribute. Now, Aztec tribute was a pretty rough business, as we know. Inca tribute was often, again, do the work, like be part of these infrastructure projects, building roads or bridges or whatnot. So the Spanish were like, yeah, so it's like that, basically. It's like that. We're the new Inca rulers, and you provide the labor. Except, in reality, the working conditions on building roads and bridges was one thing. It wasn't a death trip. It wasn't like working in a death camp or a death project, the way that a lot of this work that the Spanish had them doing in the plantations and silver mines was. The overwork was crazy, coupled with the disease that just sort of naturally weakened these people. The encomienda system was just marked by brutal abuse, and it's slave labor. I mean, you can call it what you want, where you say, no, we're teaching them about Christianity. You're not embodying Christianity, to say the least, with this encomienda system. So look, in some back room for some king somewhere, it seemed like it made sense, or it seemed justified. In reality, it was brutal abuse of the indigenous peoples at the hands of this new empire, this new maritime empire, trying to extract all the silver, gold, and sugar wealth that could be had there. In particular, guys, the most notorious labor conditions were in these sugar plantations because of the backbreaking nature of the agricultural work, and then just the heat, just the miserable situation. You had a hard time living 5-10 years doing this work. So it's pretty brutal stuff. It also speaks, we're going to talk about the African slave trade later, the rate at which indigenous peoples died off in this encomienda system accelerated the need to bring in African slaves, which is, it's a solution that has a whole new set of problems that goes along with it. It is noteworthy that it's not just these governors and viceroys and conquistadors being sent over by the Spanish to these colonies. They're also sending over friars, monks, missionaries. Now, they're doing this for a few different reasons, right? So again, this is all a project of the Spanish monarchs. The monarchs are doing this in part because, let's just say one part of the pie is sincere religious devotion. And so they want to spread the gospel to more people. Let's put that on the pie chart somewhere as one of their motivations. One of their motivations is rivalry with this emerging Protestant Reformation. And the Catholics see, ground that they might have lost in Europe, they can gain in the Americas by establishing a Catholic foothold there. And another slice of the pie was a recognition, a quiet recognition that these conquistadors, this was a nasty crew that was, not exactly humanitarian or humane. And so you send the missionaries or the friars over to be a sort of a humane voice, right? And to sort of temper the excesses of the military presence there. That was only limited in its success. The famous exception to this, or the most famous name of these Spanish friars, and a name worth our esteem, is a man named Bartolome de las Casas. So de las Casas is a Jesuit. Boy, did I write that? A Dominican, pardon me, a Dominican friar. So a Catholic monk who he pioneers a humanitarian argument that slavery is wrong in all its forms, regardless of the justification being offered. It's just fundamentally wrong to capture and enslave other people, a Christian voice speaking out in this regard. And he says these indigenous peoples are not fit for slavery. They are not accustomed to this, and the treatment of them is miserable. He documents that. And then, he punctuates it with messages like, for they are our brothers and Christ gave his life for them. They bear the image of God. Therefore, this is wrong to do. And he is crying out. His intended audience is the Spanish crown. It's the Spanish monarch. And frankly, it has some effect because the encomienda system is reformed. Now, it's not really dismantled, but it is sort of reformed. And there is a recognition that this is a system that is broken in its excesses and in its inhumane treatment of indigenous peoples. I'm sorry to say, though, that this is sort of only the start of the story of inhumane treatments of slave populations in the Americas. More to come on that, unfortunately. Now, all these Spanish arriving in the New World, I mentioned the people who are coming are Spanish missionaries and then conquistadors and royal viceroys and governors. These are not like settlers who are coming to like colonize or set up their own farms or looking for their own plot of land, like what you might see in like British North America, where we might be more familiar with it, by the way. They're mostly men. Let's name that. It's mostly men. And especially among those conquistadors or like the all this martial military class, there is a desire, a need, I suppose, to make families, and so many of the women that became wives or mothers come from the indigenous population, or sometimes the enslaved population. And so, what happens in New Spain, or the Spanish Maritime Empire in the Americas, is a lot of racial mixing, much more racial mixing than would happen in the English colonies in North America. And frankly, the English later on would be like, and that's the screwed up thing about the Spanish is how much racial mixing they did. We'll look at that later on. And the Spanish develop, again, a social hierarchy. We've seen them. All societies have some sort of social hierarchy. There's a very distinct one here. This is called the casta system. And it's like a hierarchy that delineates all the various combinations that can come from a population of Europeans and indigenous peoples, and increasingly African slaves. And so all these different castas or classes have these different legal statuses. And we'll note at the top are the peninsulares. And the peninsulares are people who are white, people of European descent who were born back in Spain. So they're from the old world and they came here. They are at the top. They have the highest legal and illegal status and economic privileges. And below them are the Creoles. Creoles are people of 100% European descent, but they were born here in the New World. So there is some resentment between Creoles and Peninsulares. And then mestizos are people of European and indigenous descent, and you can have mulattoes of European and African descent and everything. And at the very bottom, you have Native Americans, indigenous populations there. There are episodes, of course, where people at the bottom attempted to rise up and overthrow these social hierarchies. They ended about like you would expect, with pretty brutal violence and unsuccessfully. Speaking of unsuccessful, the Spanish extraction of wealth from the New World is initially, and by initially, I mean, for about 100 years, an extraordinarily successful thing. It's like Spain feels like, my gosh, we hit the jackpot. It's like we pulled the slot machine, all sevens popped up, or whatever it is when you win at a slot machine, all cherries. I don't know what it goes, but anyway, a bunch of money starts dumping out, and that's sort of what this American empire feels like at first. And Spain shows more or less zero discretion in terms of extracting wealth. Just like pull as much gold, silver, and everything as you can, gold and silver out of the ground as you possibly can. We want to bring it back for the Spanish crown to spend for its adventures and its stuff back home. This ends up backfiring. This is one of those few times in history where you introduce enough gold, or in this case, gold and silver, into your economy that you manage to wreck the value of gold and silver. And they did that. They caused pretty crippling inflation to their own economy. And that had effects in the world economy by the middle of the 17th century. And this ends up really weakening Spain. Their lack of discretion or lack of wisdom in how quickly they tried to pull this out ends up creating problems, economic headaches for them, which is reasons why, like today, oil-producing countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia don't just pump as much oil out of the ground as they possibly can in any given year. They try to regulate it because they want to control the value of that commodity. And at the same time that all that's going on, Spain loses some territories in the Netherlands. The Spanish Armada is this attempt to attack England. That fails. So a bunch of bad news happens, and Spain sort of suffers a setback that it will never really recover from. And so the Spanish Empire has this incredible first 100 years, and its own excesses end up leading to some of its demise. Let's go north here for the back end of our lesson. The British Empire will pioneer a different sort of strategy. Their method of empire building is a joint stock company. A joint stock company is kind of like a corporation, in that in a joint stock company, a bunch of people can buy stock in a company, and then as the value of that company rises, the value of that stock will rise. So it's a way of kind of spreading out the investment money, spreading out the amount of money it takes to operate that company, and spreading out the risk of a large company as well. Anyway, the company that the British used was called the British East India Company. And again, so the idea is when the British would build empires or establish outposts in East India, this means the Indian Ocean. There's a West India Company as well that operated in the Caribbean. But when they would establish these outposts, it wasn't like a military operation of the British Crown, like the Spanish did, where everything is sort of centrally run between the Crown and like the military. It's more like the British said to this company, hey, do you want to operate our colonies in the Indian Ocean for us? We'll give you a charter, or like a monopoly. No one else is allowed, no other British company is allowed to do this. And we'll give you some backing. And so it creates this one mega company that has a government monopoly to move into the Indian Ocean and seek to establish Britain's interests there. It would become this monster of a company. My daughter seems to know all about it from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So anyway, that's not exactly the point, but in an example of how powerful this company came, the British East India Company took control of India. I say that again. This company, a private company with government backing or a government monopoly, took control of the Indian subcontinent. This was following the death of the Mughal Empire Aurangzeb. Bit by bit, chunk by chunk, this company took control. This company had its own private military. This company had its own private flag. It was like a de facto country that was aligned with the British Crown. When Britain was hard up for money, when Parliament needed money, when the Crown needed money, the East India Company would loan it money in return for further protections and squashing other attempts by other companies to compete with it. I mean, it was like an ungodly powerful company, to the point where it became a real problem. We'll learn later on in the course about how the British had to sort of take this company apart. But this was a method of their empire building. They just outsourced it to a private company and let the company do all the dirty work. The Dutch did a very similar thing. The Dutch East India Company, the initials of that company are VOC and whatever, and that's in their language, but you sometimes see VOC referenced. The Dutch East India Company became, for a period of time, the largest and most profitable company in the world. The Dutch are sort of moving in and taking control of all of Portugal's old trading posts in Southeast Asia, in many places, in parts of India, parts of Africa, and controlling the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. So look, like this system, the Northern powers using sort of outsourcing it through these private companies was a really interesting way that they managed their empire. Okay, so that's the end of our lesson here. There's going to be a reflection question for you on Google Classroom. What was a key cause and effect of the rise of European empires in this period? And how was all this different from what came before? Students, thank you for your work on this. Good luck on the rest of your lesson today. And yeah, I'll see you soon. Bye.